Dear learners, welcome back to WSE True Stories, where English learning becomes an unforgettable adventure. Today, you're about to hear a powerful true story. Not just about science. Not just about disease. But about courage, obsession, and belief in something no one else could see. A story about a man who changed the fate of millions by daring to look deeper into the invisible world. He was not a doctor. He never touched a scalpel. Yet his discoveries saved more lives than any surgeon ever could. From milk to silk, from rabies to cholera, his fight was against the unseen enemies of mankind. And he battled them not with weapons, but with his microscope and his relentless mind. This is the story of Louis Pasteur, a humble chemist, a father of microbiology, and one of the most important people to ever walk this earth. But it wasn't easy. He faced rejection, humiliation, and devastating grief. His ideas were mocked. His methods doubted. And yet, he kept going. This is not just a story of science. It's a journey of vision, resilience, and quiet revolution. Improve your English listening, vocabulary, and comprehension, but more than that, let your heart be inspired by a man who refused to give up. Get ready for one of the most powerful and motivational stories in history. Let's start the journey. Louis Pasteur was born on December 27, 1822, in the small town of Dole, in eastern France. The world he entered was full of mystery and hardship, especially when it came to illness. At the time, people believed that disease came from bad air, curses, or even punishment from God. Germs were unknown. Doctors had no concept of hygiene. Surgeons operated with unwashed hands. Infections after childbirth, amputations, or even minor wounds were so common that they were almost expected. Pasteur's father, Jean-Joseph Pasteur, was a humble tanner, a man who processed animal hides into leather. A former soldier under Napoleon, Jean-Joseph was a man of discipline, honor, and hard work. He had little education, but he believed deeply in values like patriotism, perseverance, and education. He hoped that his son might have the chances he never did. The family wasn't wealthy. Their home was modest, and life was simple. But from an early age, young Louis showed signs of something special. He was quiet and thoughtful, with a love for drawing and an intense curiosity about the natural world. He would spend hours observing things around him, animals, plants, even the way water moved. His teachers noticed his talent in art, and some even thought he might become a painter. But his father, ever practical, hoped for something more stable. Education, he believed, was the way forward. And so, despite the family's limited means, they supported Louis in his studies. He wasn't an outstanding student at first. In fact, Louis struggled during his early years. He was slow to learn to read and didn't stand out in class. But what he lacked in speed, he made up for in determination. And soon, with effort and discipline, his grades improved. As he entered his teenage years, Louis was accepted into better schools, first in Arbois and later in Paris. The city overwhelmed him at first. He missed his family terribly and nearly gave up. But something inside him, perhaps his father's silent strength, pushed him onward. He stayed, he studied, and slowly, he began to excel. It was during this time that Louis discovered chemistry. The complexity of molecules, the beauty of scientific order, these things lit a fire in his mind. It was a new kind of art, one that spoke not to the eye, but to the intellect. Still, he had no idea where this path would lead him. The world was changing fast, Industries were rising, cities were growing, and disease was spreading. Soon, Louis Pasteur would find himself in the middle of a battle no one could see. And it all began with a simple question that refused to let go. As Pasteur grew older and more immersed in the world of science, he began to notice something strange, something unsettling. He had entered the École Normale Supérieure, one of the most prestigious institutions in France, and soon found himself surrounded by bright minds and fierce debates. Chemistry, physics, biology, these disciplines were opening new doors to how humans understood the world. But there was still one enormous mystery: disease. People were dying from infections no one could explain. Mothers died during childbirth. Soldiers survived battle wounds only to perish from gangrene. Children caught fevers and faded away without warning. And every time, doctors could do little more than watch helplessly. Many in the medical field believed that illnesses came from miasmas or bad air. Some thought disease simply appeared from nothing, spontaneous generation. Meat left out would rot and become filled with maggots. Surely, life had created itself. But something about that idea disturbed Pasteur. It didn't sit right with the clarity and logic he had come to love in chemistry. If life could arise from nothing, what were the laws of nature worth? Where was the order? The reason? He began to investigate. Pasteur threw himself into experiments, questioning the very foundations of what people thought they knew. He boiled liquids, sealed them off from air, then watched. Nothing grew. But when he allowed dust and air to enter, suddenly, life appeared, tiny, invisible life. He realized that what people thought was spontaneous generation was, in fact, contamination. Microorganisms, tiny creatures, invisible to the naked eye, were all around. They traveled through the air, landed in open containers, and multiplied. They were the true culprits. But there was a problem. The scientific community was not ready to believe him. Pasteur was still young, and his ideas were radical. Older scientists dismissed him. Doctors laughed at the notion that unseen creatures could be responsible for disease. They pointed to centuries of tradition, to old textbooks, to what had always been known. Pasteur was frustrated, but not discouraged. He began to gather evidence, step by step. He used swan neck flasks, carefully crafted glass containers that allowed air in but kept particles out. In these, his liquids remained clear and unspoiled. In others, exposed to dust and air, decay quickly followed. The conclusion was clear: life did not appear spontaneously. It came from life, microscopic life. Still, the resistance was fierce. And this was only the beginning. Outside the laboratory, disease was wreaking havoc. In France, silkworms, a vital part of the economy, were dying mysteriously, devastating the silk industry. Farmers were desperate. The government was losing millions. And they turned to Pasteur. What could a chemist do about a plague of dying insects? He wasn't sure. But he said yes. He traveled to the countryside, far from his lab and comforts, and began to study the sick worms. He examined them under microscopes, dissected their bodies, and tracked their conditions. Slowly, he uncovered the cause: an invisible parasite, spreading from one worm to the next. Once again, tiny life forms were at the heart of a massive problem. Pasteur's theory was gaining strength. His work with silkworms not only saved the industry, it proved a bigger idea. Disease could be caused by microorganisms. But not everyone was convinced. And the next challenge would be even greater, an illness that struck not insects, but humans. Pasteur's success with the silkworms gave him credibility, but it also raised the stakes. If tiny organisms could destroy an entire silk industry, what else could they do? Pasteur began to ask a bold question: could these same invisible agents be the cause of human diseases? At the time, this idea was still met with fierce skepticism. Doctors, trained in old traditions, didn't want to believe that their hands, their tools, or the air around them might be the real enemies of their patients. Hospitals were often places where people went to die, not heal. But Pasteur wasn't just a thinker. He was a doer. He began to focus his attention on a deadly disease that was destroying the lives of farmers and herders across Europe: anthrax. The disease killed livestock quickly and painfully, leaving behind scenes of horror: bloated, stiff carcasses in the fields, families devastated by economic loss, communities haunted by fear. Scientists had discovered the bacterium responsible for anthrax, but no one had a way to stop it. Pasteur took it as a personal mission. He and his team set up a bold experiment in a small village in southern France. He had developed a weakened form of the anthrax bacteria, a vaccine, and now he would test it publicly. He gathered two groups of sheep, one vaccinated, one not. Then, both groups were exposed to anthrax. The results stunned the onlookers. The unvaccinated sheep died within days. The vaccinated ones lived. It was a dramatic, undeniable victory. Pasteur had not only proven that microbes cause disease, he had shown that they could be fought, even defeated. His germ theory was no longer a theory. It was a turning point in the history of medicine. And yet, his work was far from over. One of the most terrifying diseases of the time was rabies. It was a slow, horrific death sentence. Once symptoms began, agitation, hallucinations, choking, there was no cure. Victims, often children, suffered and died in agony. Pasteur had never worked directly with humans before. He wasn't a doctor. But he believed that science had a responsibility to step in where there was darkness and fear. He began experimenting with rabies in animals, studying the progression of the virus, and attempting to weaken it through drying the infected nervous tissue. It was dangerous, controversial work. At one point, Pasteur even infected himself accidentally during an experiment, but he survived. Still, he had never tested his vaccine on a human. Then, one July afternoon in 1885, a desperate mother arrived at Pasteur's laboratory, carrying her 9-year-old son, Joseph Meister. The boy had been bitten by a rabid dog. Without intervention, he would surely die. Pasteur was not a licensed physician. Administering treatment could result in criminal charges. But standing in front of the terrified mother and the trembling child, Pasteur faced a choice. Do nothing and let the boy die. Or risk everything, his reputation, his freedom, his life's work, to try to save him. He looked at the boy and said yes. For 10 days, Pasteur administered a series of increasingly strong injections, each dose a gamble. Days passed in silence. The child showed no signs of illness. On the 14th day, Joseph Meister smiled. He had survived. It was a miracle, not born of mystery or magic, but of science, courage, and sacrifice. Pasteur's name spread like wildfire. He was no longer just a chemist or a theorist, he had become a savior to many. But not all reactions were praise. Some accused him of playing God. Others questioned his methods, calling them reckless or unethical. What do you think? Should Pasteur have taken the risk and treated a human without a medical license? Or was it too dangerous, even with good intentions? Share your thoughts in the comments. But that wasn't the end of his journey. Because Pasteur was about to face the greatest challenge of all, not in the lab, but in his own body. In the wake of Joseph Meister's survival, Louis Pasteur was hailed as a hero. Newspapers praised him. Governments honored him. Parents wept with gratitude. The rabies vaccine had turned the tide on one of the most horrifying diseases of the era. But behind the applause and accolades, Pasteur's health was quietly breaking down. Years of grueling work, toxic exposure to chemicals, and the emotional strain of relentless experiments had taken their toll. Just before his triumph with rabies, he had suffered a massive stroke. The entire left side of his body was left partially paralyzed. Most people would have retired. Many would have given up. Pasteur did not. He learned to walk again, clumsily. He continued to work, one hand trembling, the other guiding test tubes. His mind remained sharp and unwavering. But the stroke was a cruel reminder, his time was limited. This realization didn't make him retreat, it only deepened his sense of urgency. And now, something much bigger was at stake. Pasteur dreamed of building an institute, a place where science could thrive, where young researchers could pursue knowledge freely, and where cures could be discovered for diseases yet unknown. He envisioned a future where the war against illness was fought not by individuals, but by entire armies of scientists. But the idea was revolutionary and expensive. He faced opposition from politicians, who saw science as impractical and Pasteur as idealistic. They questioned why so much money should be spent on something as uncertain as medical research. So Pasteur made an extraordinary decision. He took his case directly to the people. In newspapers, at public events, through letters and speeches, he appealed to families, teachers, farmers, and workers. He spoke not in the cold logic of science, but in the warm language of human compassion. He told them, "Science knows no country, because knowledge belongs to humanity, and is the torch which illuminates the world." And the people responded. Donations came in, small ones from poor families, large ones from industrialists, and generous ones from foreign governments inspired by his work. France, Germany, Russia, all contributed. In 1888, the Pasteur Institute opened its doors in Paris. It was the first of its kind, a research center dedicated entirely to the study of infectious diseases. Young scientists from around the world arrived to train under Pasteur's guidance. It was more than a building, it was a living symbol of hope, innovation, and international cooperation. But while the institute grew, another silent war raged within Pasteur's body. He suffered a second stroke. Then a third. His strength declined rapidly. Still, he continued to mentor students, review research, and share his vision. And then, one day, Joseph Meister, the very boy whose life Pasteur had saved, returned. Now a man, Joseph had come to the Pasteur Institute to work. He took on the quiet job of caretaker, tending the gardens and cleaning the halls, never forgetting the man who had given him a second chance at life. One day, Pasteur asked Joseph to sit with him in the garden. Weakened and thin, Pasteur looked into the eyes of the man he had once treated as a terrified child. He whispered, "You were the proof that I was right to believe. You gave my life purpose." It was one of the last conversations Pasteur would have. Louis Pasteur passed away on September 28, 1895, at the age of 72. He died surrounded by family, students, and the quiet legacy of a life that had altered the course of human history. He had fought disease with science, challenged the beliefs of his time, and sacrificed his health for the lives of strangers. In doing so, he proved something powerful. That the smallest forces, germs, yes, but also ideas, dreams, and courage, can change the world. And still today, every time we take a vaccine, every time we wash our hands, every time a disease is prevented before it spreads, Pasteur is there, silently shaping our lives. But here's a question worth thinking about. If you had one life-changing idea, would you fight for it like Pasteur did, even if no one believed you at first? Let me know what you think in the comments. But we're not quite finished yet. Because the story of Pasteur didn't end with his death. His legacy lives on in powerful, surprising ways. Even after his passing, Louis Pasteur's work stirred fierce debates and created seismic shifts in the medical world. The Pasteur Institute became a battlefield of ideas. His methods, once considered controversial, were now being taken seriously and adapted. But not everyone welcomed this change. Doctors trained in traditional medicine pushed back. They claimed that Pasteur's focus on invisible microbes was too narrow. Some argued that he was undermining centuries of medical practice. Others were threatened by the speed at which science was overtaking superstition. But Pasteur's students, men and women trained in his lab, guided by his philosophy, were not afraid to fight back. They were trained not only in technique, but in mindset. Doubt everything, Pasteur had taught them, until you can prove it. He had lit a fire in their hearts, a passion for truth, no matter how uncomfortable. One of the fiercest battles erupted when his team began testing vaccines for diphtheria, a disease that killed thousands of children each year. The vaccine worked, but the idea of injecting children with even a weakened form of the disease horrified many. Angry parents protested. Religious leaders objected. Newspapers published scathing articles accusing scientists of playing God. Pasteur's successors faced a difficult choice: abandon the research and protect their reputation, or push forward, risking public anger to save lives. They chose the second path. Under the guidance of Émile Roux, a brilliant scientist and Pasteur's closest collaborator, the team pressed forward. They conducted trials, refined their methods, and slowly, carefully, began saving lives. The victory wasn't just scientific, it was moral. It proved that science, when done ethically and transparently, could serve humanity in the most profound way. But sacrifices were made along the way. Researchers were often isolated from their communities, criticized by religious authorities, and emotionally burdened by the weight of human suffering. Some died from accidental exposure. Others left the field, overwhelmed by stress and grief. It's easy to admire the breakthroughs from a distance, the miracle of vaccines, the defeat of deadly diseases, but few see the emotional cost. The long nights. The failed experiments. The fear of being wrong. The guilt when a cure doesn't come in time. Pasteur had known that burden well. And he carried it quietly, even proudly, because he believed in the cause. His deepest belief wasn't just that germs cause disease, it was that human beings could fight back, armed with knowledge and courage. And now, others were continuing that mission. One of the Pasteur Institute's most significant triumphs came years later when it helped develop a vaccine for tuberculosis, a disease that had haunted Pasteur's childhood. He had seen it claim the lives of poor families, weakening entire generations. The vaccine, called BCG, was created by two scientists inspired by Pasteur's vision, Albert Calmet and Camille Guérin. They named the vaccine after themselves, but dedicated the success to the man who had shown them the way. The world began to change. Child mortality rates dropped. Life expectancy rose. Entire communities that had once lived in fear of infection could now breathe a little easier. Schools stayed open. Families remained whole. But Pasteur's ideas didn't just change medicine. They changed mindsets. People started to see that disease wasn't punishment, it was preventable. That suffering wasn't fate, it could be fought. That science wasn't cold and mechanical, it was a form of compassion, expressed in microscopes and lab coats instead of poetry or song. And perhaps most powerfully, his legacy bridged the gap between knowledge and action. Because it's one thing to know how a virus works. It's another thing to risk everything to stop it. But here's something that often sparks debate. Should scientists prioritize public acceptance when introducing new treatments, or push ahead in the name of progress, even when society isn't ready? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. Because the heart of science, like the heart of storytelling, isn't just about answers. It's about the courage to ask better questions. And in the next part of our journey, we'll explore the lasting achievements of Louis Pasteur's work, achievements that continue to shape your life every single day, even if you've never heard his name. By the time Louis Pasteur reached the later years of his life, he had already transformed the world in ways few could have imagined. The vaccines he developed, especially for rabies and anthrax, were saving lives across Europe and beyond. The small boy he treated for rabies, Joseph Meister, lived a long life and went on to work at the Pasteur Institute, dedicating himself to preserving the legacy of the man who had saved him. Pasteur's germ theory had become widely accepted. Hospitals began adopting sterilization techniques. Surgeons started washing their hands and cleaning their instruments, simple actions that dramatically reduced post-surgical deaths. Maternity wards, once tragically dangerous for mothers, became significantly safer. Milk, wine, and beer were now routinely pasteurized, a word taken from Pasteur's very name, to prevent spoilage and disease. Every time someone opened a fresh bottle of milk or enjoyed a safe glass of wine, they were benefiting from Pasteur's scientific breakthroughs. But his impact reached far beyond laboratories and clinics. He had inspired a new generation of scientists, not just to study microbes, but to ask deeper questions about health, society, and human dignity. His methods became the foundation of microbiology, a field that would one day help us understand everything from pandemics to probiotics. The Pasteur Institute, founded in 1887, just 1 year before his death, stood as a beacon for scientific discovery. It attracted researchers from all over the globe, united by a single mission, to improve human health through science. But perhaps the most profound achievement wasn't a vaccine, a theory, or a discovery. It was the change in thinking. In a world once dominated by superstition and fear, Pasteur helped people understand that knowledge could be a weapon against ignorance, and compassion could drive innovation. He was not a doctor. He never treated patients in the traditional sense. But his work probably saved more lives than any physician of his time. When he died in 1895, the world mourned. In France, flags flew at half-mast. Scientific institutions across the world paid tribute. Even those who had once doubted him now praised his vision, his discipline, and his deep sense of purpose. He was buried in a crypt at the Pasteur Institute, where his legacy continues to inspire. On the walls surrounding his tomb are carved scenes from his life, moments of triumph, yes, but also moments of hardship, struggle, and relentless determination. Because his greatest achievement wasn't just defeating disease. It was proving that science, driven by empathy, could change the fate of humanity. Today, we take many things for granted: clean water, safe food, modern hospitals. But none of it would be possible without the groundwork laid by Louis Pasteur. Every time a child receives a vaccine, every time a surgeon washes their hands before an operation, every time a researcher peers into a microscope, searching for answers, they are continuing the journey he began. And in those moments, Pasteur's quiet, relentless voice still echoes. Fortune favors the prepared mind. So the next time you hear the word pasteurized, remember, it's not just a scientific term. It's a symbol of one man's lifelong fight for truth, healing, and the belief that even invisible enemies can be defeated with clarity, courage, and care. But his story isn't over yet. Because the legacy of Louis Pasteur isn't just in the past, it lives on in every act of prevention, every discovery, and every lesson learned from hardship. In the next and final chapter, we'll reflect on the enduring lessons of his life, and how they still speak to us today in a world where science and humanity continue to intersect. Louis Pasteur once said, "Science knows no country, because knowledge belongs to humanity, and is the torch which illuminates the world." That belief guided every step of his journey, from a small town in France to the highest circles of science and global impact. But his legacy goes far beyond laboratories, vaccines, or even the field of microbiology. It lies in the values he lived by: humility, perseverance, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of truth. Pasteur never sought fame. He wasn't motivated by wealth or prestige. He was driven by a deep, personal sense of responsibility, a belief that if he had the knowledge to save lives, then he had the duty to act. And this sense of duty extended to how he saw science itself, not as something to be hoarded, but as something to be shared. At a time when many scientists competed fiercely for recognition, Pasteur opened his doors, trained students, and built institutions that would outlive him. The Pasteur Institute, founded just before his death, became a center of global innovation. It was there that future breakthroughs would emerge, like the discovery of the HIV virus decades later. His work laid the foundation for countless advances in immunology, public health, and infectious disease control. But beyond the science, Louis Pasteur taught us something even more powerful: that one person, with a prepared mind and a kind heart, can alter the course of history. He reminded us that invisible enemies, germs, viruses, bacteria, can bring fear and death, but they can also be defeated with careful observation, methodical thinking, and human cooperation. And perhaps, more importantly, he showed that science doesn't have to be cold or distant. It can be emotional. It can be moral. It can be filled with purpose. In many ways, Pasteur's life was a mirror to our own challenges today. We live in a world still shaped by disease, still searching for cures, still wrestling with misinformation and fear. And in these times, Pasteur's story speaks louder than ever. It reminds us that progress is possible, that knowledge matters, and that when we come together, scientists, teachers, families, and communities, we can build a safer, healthier world. So, as you reflect on Pasteur's journey, ask yourself, if you had the chance to help millions through your own skills, how far would you go? That was the question Louis Pasteur asked himself every day, and his answer changed the world. Dear learners, we've now come to the end of an unforgettable journey, a journey of courage, resilience, and hope, told through the life of Louis Pasteur. From a quiet boy in rural France to the father of microbiology, Pasteur's life reminds us that true greatness begins not with talent, but with purpose. He didn't have wealth. He didn't come from power. What he had was something stronger, a commitment to use his knowledge for good, no matter the cost. His legacy is not just in vaccines or test tubes, it's in every hospital that saves a life, every child protected from disease, every scientist who dares to dream. And maybe it's in you too. Maybe you're learning English because you want to make a difference. Maybe you're struggling, unsure, wondering if it's worth the effort. But just like Pasteur said, fortune favors the prepared mind. Every step you take in learning, every word, every sentence, is preparing you for something greater. So today, don't just take away vocabulary or grammar. Take away belief. Belief in yourself, in the power of learning, and in the idea that knowledge, when used with compassion, can heal the world. Now it's your turn. What lesson do you think can be learned from this story? And did it remind you of something in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your voice. If this story moved you, help others feel it too. Like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring journeys that help you grow in English and in spirit. Until next time, keep learning, keep dreaming, and carry the light of knowledge with you. Goodbye for now.